I purchased a $100,000 sports card for only $100. That's right. Now, if you've clicked on this video, you're probably wondering, what is the card? How did you buy a $100,000 card for only $100? And have you been clickbaited? Well, let me assure you straight away, you have not been clickbaited. In this video, we're going to cover something called asymmetric information. Shout out to my economics degree behind me. So what do we have here in my hand? This is your first glimpse of the card. This is a 1930s Mazzetti Fred Perry card. Here's a close-up of my 1930 Fred Perry, SCG graded, coming back at a grade 1. Now, you're probably sitting at home thinking to yourself, who the hell is Fred Perry? And if you're asking that question, I don't blame you, because I asked the same question 3 weeks ago. My journey towards buying this six-figure card all started when I went to Wimbledon about 3 weeks ago for the first time ever in my life. When I was walking around Wimbledon, there was a statue of Fred Perry, didn't even know who that was, as I said, and everyone was queuing up to take pictures with this statue. I'm talking fat, bold guys with Rolexes and APs, all the way to those Instagram hoes. And it got me thinking, who is this guy? Why is everyone queuing up to take a picture with the statue? And why does Wimbledon, the most prestigious sports event in the whole world, only have one statue of one tennis player, and it is this guy here, Fred Perry? So let's break down who is Fred Perry first, because if we understand the player, you'll understand why this was such a bargain. And what we're going to cover today isn't one rare example. I've seen this happen so many times on eBay. So many $100 cards which are actually worth intrinsically so much more, and sellers don't know what they have. Now, Fred Perry was a British world #1 who won 8 Grand Slam tournaments, 2 Pro Slams, and 6 major double titles. Now, this might sound like nothing if you're a tennis person in terms of stat for stat achievements, and it sounded like nothing to me and the seller when I purchased this card, but we're going to clarify and debunk that. So let's signify how historic some of these achievements were. Fred Perry won Wimbledon 3 years in a row from 1934 to 1936. Prior to Andy Murray in 2013, Fred Perry was the last British player to win Wimbledon. He was also the last British player to win a Grand Slam title until Andy Murray in 2012, when Andy Murray won the US Open. Yes, other tennis players have won Wimbledon between Fred Perry and Andy Murray, and other tennis players have won Grand Slams, but it took 80 years for another British player to win Wimbledon. And why is this so important? Well, #1, Britain is the home of modern tennis. It originated in the UK, in Birmingham, my home city. #2, Wimbledon is the oldest tennis tournament, the most prestigious tennis tournament, and it's a British tennis tournament. So the fact it took another British player 80 years to win Wimbledon just shows how significant the achievements of Fred Perry was back in the 1930s. And he did it 3 times in a row. Fred Perry was also the first ever player to win a career Grand Slam. That means he won the Australian Open, the US Open, the French Open, and Wimbledon. This was the first time anyone had won all 4, and he remains the only British player to ever do this. Now, this is where we dive into what we call asymmetric information. One thing economics taught me, if you want to make super profits in this world, you need imperfect or asymmetric information, and that's exactly what we have in the card industry. Don't get me wrong, stat for stat, if you're a tennis person and you're watching this video, you're probably thinking, stat for stat, Fred Perry is nothing. And you're right, stat for stat, you wouldn't even consider Fred Perry as one of the greatest tennis players of all time. But there's a few factors that modern day card collectors overlook, and this is very important. The first thing card collectors often overlook is the significance and impact older players had on the sports that we know today. And #2, the truth is, the further back you go, we're talking 1930s here, the further back you go, you're not dealing with cards anymore. Stuff like this is a historical artifact, and we'll dive into this subject a bit more further in this video. But this card here is older than some of the artifacts Wimbledon have in their museum about Fred Perry. Just think about that statement for a second. In my hand is an item older than some of the artifacts they have at the Wimbledon Museum. Wimbledon couldn't have this card if they tried, and you're gonna see why later in the video. It's not like they can go to the Topps website and just start ripping up packs, or go onto eBay and just buy some sealed packs and start ripping. So I mentioned significance and impact on the sport. Let's touch on why this is very important. So we're gonna have to have a bit of a history lesson, unfortunately, here. But if you go back to Fred Perry's time, if you go back to the foundation of Wimbledon, UK tennis was always dominated by the elitist class. It was a rich man's sport, primarily taken up by people down south, and it was gate-kept as that. Fred Perry came from a working class family in Stockport. He was not an elitist, he had no money to his name, and he came from the north. He managed to break through the class barrier which gatekept tennis from so many people. And not only did he break through it, he rose to the top as the #1 player. This changed the perception of tennis, it challenged old school norms, and it also inspired a wave of working class people to take up tennis. In fact, this was such an issue for the societies and communities that ran tennis, they actually banned Fred Perry from tennis in the UK in 1936. Imagine challenging the status quo so much they just go and ban you from tennis in the whole of the UK. And that is while being #1 in the world. You are the #1 ranked player, and UK tennis says, nah, you're banned, we don't like your background, we don't like what you stand for, tennis isn't for you or people like you. Now there's several reasons Fred Perry got this ban from UK tennis. A lot of it was political, as mentioned. The final straw that broke the camel's back and led to his ban was Fred Perry was the first person to professionalize tennis. You see, in the 1930s, prestigious tennis tournaments like Wimbledon were for amateur players only. This means that players that participated in these tournaments were not allowed to earn a living from tennis. The reason this rule was in place is because it gatekept tennis. If you weren't allowed to earn a living from tennis, it meant only the wealthy could participate, those from a wealthy background or those that had sources of income. Otherwise, if you didn't have money, you don't have time to be playing tennis. Tennis was a rich man's hobby sport. As a result, making tennis was decided as a big no, and if you decided to make money from tennis, you would be banned from tennis tournaments. Fred Perry completely challenged this. #1, he was the first person to begin doing worldwide professional tours. #2, because of these tours, he put tennis on a global stage for the non-elite to watch as well. #3, all of these activities laid the groundwork for modern day organizations and governing bodies we have today in tennis that bring equality. And #4, all of his activities showed that tennis could be a viable career for anyone, not just a pastime for the wealthy. Fred Perry's sacrifice from being banned in competing in major tournaments while being world #1 laid the foundations of modern tennis. It allowed players we see today to pursue tennis as a career and be paid for it. And this is regardless of your background. And all of this class barrier breakage doesn't even touch other areas he revolutionized. We're gonna completely skip areas like his approach to routine training, which laid the foundations of modern day sports preparation. #2 is innovating style of play, which inspired the use of wrist movement for spin and power. And #3, his cultural impact on the fashion world of tennis. So let's move on to price action now. I talked about historical significance. Do you want to guess the population of this card? I'll give you a few seconds, just have a guess in your mind. This card has a PS population of 2 and an SGC population of 1. That's right, only 3 of these cards are on record, and this card is almost 100 years old. This is the only SGC graded card in the world, and that's what I mean when I say Wimbledon couldn't have this card if they tried. Where are they going to go to get this card? Only 3 are on record. This does belong in the Wimbledon Museum. They have a Fred Perry section. This belongs right there. For comparison, the iconic T209 1909 Honus Wagner has a population of 32. That is a card that sells for millions at a minimum, and there's a population of 32. Even the classic rookie 1958 Pele has a population over 100. And I won't even touch on like Mickey Mantle, Mike Trout, and all of those other classic cards. Now call me delusional, but I believe at a minimum this card is the equivalent of a rookie Pele. I would go as far to compare it to the Honus Wagner card. It's not even a big statement to say Fred Perry was at least 10% as great as Honus Wagner, because Honus Wagner still sells for 7 figures, and that would still make this a 6-figure card. 15% of billionaires watch or play tennis as their primary sport. Tennis attracts big money. It might not have the same viewership stats as, let's say, football, basketball, baseball, American football, but tennis has big money behind it. There's a reason Rolex sponsored tennis, and tennis still gets at least 100 million views per year, so it's not a small sport either. It's still a big sport, but it has a wealthy background behind it. So you're telling me this card isn't worth at least $100,000 when a Honus Wagner PSA 1.5 sells for 3.7 million, or a Luka Doncic sells for 5 million, or a Wayne Gretzky, if I said that right, sells for $4 million. In fact, even a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Futera rookie card sold for 500k. You're telling me Kareem has had a bigger influence on a sport as Fred Perry did on tennis? But apparently this card is worth $100 despite the impact Fred Perry had on tennis as a sport. They don't put statues of you at Wimbledon, the most prestigious sports event in the world, for no reason. Especially when this was the same establishment that banned you when you were world number one. Wimbledon banned Fred Perry and then erected a statue. That just shows the aura he had. Now you may be wondering, if you're claiming it's a $100,000 card, why did you pick it up for $100? Well, again, as we said at the beginning of the video, asymmetric information is key here. I've been preaching this message for 3 years in the hobby. It's got slightly better, but there's still so much disparity. So much hype is centered around modern American sports cards, which I personally feel are overprinted. I do feel we're entering another junk wax era. So you've got a lot of hype on modern day American sports, and then you've got a lot of hype on what I would call mainstream vintage. I'm talking famous names that have had TV time or airtime or influencer time. If you Google the most expensive sports cards ever sold, you'll find that 60% of them are modern day basketball cards and 40% of them are vintage American cards. As a result, I said it 3 years ago and I still believe it today, there is a disparity, there is a disconnect between American sports cards and their pricing and non-American sports and their pricing. Now, I completely understand why that happens, because most collectors are based in America. As a result, that's where the money is and that's what they're watching. They're watching American sports, and that's what you need to look for in this market. You need to look where the disconnects are. The original seller wanted $1,000 for this. I said to him, what's the lowest you would take? You know what he responded? I'm not sure, I've never seen one sold before. He didn't even know in his head what he wanted to sell this for, so I offered $100 and he took it. That's what you need to look for, asymmetric information, areas where sellers are holding items which they don't even know the value of. Because the truth is, most sellers these days, if there's not a price comparable on eBay or online, they don't know what they're holding, they don't know the value of the cards that they have. Without a price comparison, these sellers just stumble, and there's no better place to utilize the lack of knowledge of sellers than vintage cards, because there's so much disinformation over vintage cards. People don't know the populations of the cards because there's just not much data on it. They don't know the player that they're holding because they haven't done their research into the player and it's an old name and everyone just cares about modern cards. And they also don't understand the historical importance of the card. As I said, this is an artifact. In my head, it's not even a card anymore. This is an actual artifact. It's a piece of history. You need to find the vintage cards where there is no hype. So that is a story on how I purchased this 100k card. I'm not even sure if it's going to focus, but 100k card for only $100. I'd be really keen to know your thoughts below. Let me know if I just sound like a dumbass. Let me know if I sound like an idiot. Let me know what you're collecting. Let me know if you agree, modern versus vintage. So yeah, I'd be keen to know your thoughts.